Dawn, a Pacific airstrip. Engines warming, propellers spinning. A young pilot climbs into a P-38 Lightning. Statistically, he should not come back. Not because the aircraft is slow, not because it lacks firepower, but because somewhere between his hands and the wings, time is being stolen. Not seconds, not even a full second, a fraction. So small it passes inspection. So small it fits inside regulations. And so deadly it kills pilots every single day. The proof was hidden in the control run, inside the booms. Aileron cables had nearly 3/8 of an inch of play. Not a defect, a tolerance. Every training manual gives the same warning. Never turn with a zero. But manuals don't fight battles. Pilots do. Because the zero doesn't win by firepower, it wins by timing. And today, one mechanic is about to steal that timing back. Not with a new aircraft, not with a new weapon, but with a fix so small it almost shouldn't matter. Almost, because it will decide who lands and who never does. At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched under the left wing of a P-38 Lightning at Dodorura Airfield, New Guinea. The metal was already warm from the rising sun. Fuel fumes hung in the air. Engines coughed, then settled into a steady, hungry roar. McKenna wasn't watching the sky. He was watching his pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 23 years old, 6 combat missions, 0 kills. Hayes sat in the cockpit running the checklist with the careful precision of someone who knew the numbers were against him. Across the strip, ground crews moved fast, quietly, like men trying not to think about the empty beds back in the tents. Because everyone understood what this morning meant. 18 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros were already airborne, climbing to intercept the patrol. Hayes would be flying straight into them. McKenna had been maintaining P-38s for 8 months. He knew the aircraft the way only a mechanic can. Not as a silhouette, but as cables, pulleys, and forces hidden beneath aluminum skin. Twin engines, twin booms, fast in a straight line, an absolute beast at high altitude, and fatally vulnerable in the one place that mattered most. The P-38 could not turn with a zero. The Zero was lighter, more agile, built to rotate through the sky like a knife. In a horizontal turn, it could outmaneuver a P-38 in nearly half the time. That difference wasn't academic. It was lethal. American doctrine was explicit. Never turn with a zero. Use speed. Use altitude. Dive in. Fire. Climb away. Hit and run. Hayes had followed that doctrine 5 times. And 5 times the Zeros adapted. They baited American pilots into defensive turns, cut inside their radius, slid onto their tails, and fired. Over the past 6 weeks, the 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s. Most weren't destroyed in clean diving passes or head-on attacks. They were killed in turning fights they could not escape. McKenna had watched too many pilots taxi out with confidence and never return. Good men. Kids, really. They climbed into their P-38s and came back in boxes. Or didn't come back at all. The reports all said the same thing. Pilot error. For pilots who met it over the Pacific, the Zero's most dangerous weapon wasn't its guns. It was timing. Because the Zero wasn't just built to turn tighter. It was built to make your aircraft feel slow, right when you needed it to respond like a reflex. Japanese engineers pursued maneuverability with ruthless focus. Armor was stripped away. Structural margins were sacrificed. Protection was traded for agility. Every design decision favored one outcome. Turn faster. Turn tighter. Turn sooner. In air combat, turning ability isn't just performance, it's positional control. A pilot can be disciplined, highly trained, perfectly calm, and still die if the enemy completes a turn a fraction of a second earlier. When the P-38 Lightning arrived in the Pacific, it looked unstoppable on paper. Twin engines, twin booms, A central cockpit like a command pod. Nose-mounted guns that didn't need convergence, speed, range, firepower. In straight-line attacks, the Lightning felt powerful, confident. But when a fight collapsed into close-range maneuvering, when a Zero forced sharp turns and sudden reversals, the P-38 began to feel wrong. Not weak, not broken, wrong. Controls that felt fine in a climb became heavy under load. Roll response lagged. The airplane hesitated at the exact moment a pilot needed it to snap. And the cruelest part was how small the delay was. Not seconds, not even a full second. A fraction, a blink, invisible on a normal flight. Fatal in a dogfight. Every briefing repeated the same doctrine. Never turn with a Zero. Use altitude, use speed, dive, fire, climb away, hit and run. The logic was sound. Combat ignored it. Zero pilots were experienced, patient, and intelligent. They understood Allied doctrine as well as Allied pilots did. They baited attacks, forced angles, and created moments where a Lightning pilot had to roll, reverse, and turn immediately. Or die. In those moments, doctrine collapsed. Instinct took over, and instinct demanded an aircraft that responded instantly. When the P-38 hesitated, even slightly, the Zero exploited it without mercy. That's why the Zero kept winning. It didn't just outturn the Lightning, it outtimed it. McKenna didn't learn that in a briefing room. He learned it by watching pilots come back. Or not come back. And the ones who did return kept describing the same moment. Same fight. Same failure. Same sentence. A week earlier, one Lightning limped back with holes punched through the boom. Tight little clusters like the Zero pilot had known exactly where the aircraft would be. The pilot climbed out shaking, stared at McKenna and said, "I rolled, nothing happened." Then the Zero was already there. That line stayed with him, because if a pilot moves the stick and the airplane doesn't bite immediately, that isn't tactics. That's time being stolen. When pilots blamed themselves, officers blamed doctrine. Engineers pointed to test charts. Everything was within specification, within tolerance, acceptable. Pilot error. But McKenna worked with his hands. He trusted what his hands could feel. So he started tracing the path between the pilot's input and the aircraft's response. Not the engines, not the guns, not the wings. The control run, cables, pulleys, linkages, hidden inside those long twin booms. He opened the access panel and pinched the aileron cable between two fingers. Then he pulled. And he felt it. Dead travel, before the aileron even began to move. Not much, about 3/8 of an inch of play, within spec. But in combat, spec doesn't save you. That dead travel meant a micro delay. Tiny, but real. Just long enough for a Zero pilot to complete the timing he'd practiced 100 times. McKenna took it to the engineering officer. The answer came back exactly the way he knew it would. Within tolerance, within specification, approved by factory standards. No field mechanic had authorization to alter flight controls. Any change required approval from Lockheed, thousands of miles away. In other words, wait. But McKenna had watched too many pilots taxi out and never return. He'd signed too many maintenance logs, stared too long at empty runways, listened to too many radios go silent. These weren't numbers to him, they were faces. And the solution forming in his mind was disturbingly simple. So simple it sounded irresponsible. A piece of wire, not a new engine, not a redesigned wing, not a complex overhaul. Just a thin piece of piano wire, bent precisely, installed as a tensioner to remove slack and give the pilot back the fraction of time the Zero kept stealing. The idea was dangerous because of how small it was. If he was wrong, he wouldn't just be breaking regulations. He'd be sending a pilot into the sky with a modified control system that could kill him. And if he was discovered, the consequences were clear. Unauthorized flight control modification. Court-martial. The end of his career. But if he did nothing, pilots would keep dying anyway. So he made a decision wartime history rarely records. Permission could wait. Survival could not. The mechanic knew exactly what he was risking. Unauthorized modification of a flight control system wasn't a paperwork issue. It was one of the most serious violations a ground crewman could commit. Engines could be swapped, panels could be replaced, battle damage could be patched, but controls were sacred. If a control system failed in the air, there was no recovery. The aircraft wouldn't limp home, it would fall. And when it fell, investigators wouldn't start in the sky. They would start on the ground, with him. McKenna chose an ordinary aircraft. No ace, no senior officer, no attention. If the idea worked on an average P-38, it would work on all of them. He worked alone. No logbook, no signature, no witness. The hangar was quiet after midnight. The air smelled of oil, fuel, and damp tropical heat. Insects buzzed around the lights. Somewhere in the distance, generators hummed. He pulled the inspection panel off the left boom. The metal was still warm from the day's sun. Inside, the aileron control cable ran through pulleys toward the tail. McKenna grabbed it with both hands and pulled. There it was again. That same dead travel. About 3/8 of an inch before the tension caught. His fingers ached from a full day of maintenance, but the slack was unmistakable. It was wrong. The piano wire came from a damaged P-38, scrapped weeks earlier. 6 inches long, high tensile. Unremarkable. He sat on the hangar floor with pliers and bent it into a Z shape. The wire fought back. His hand slipped once, then again. The second time, the edge bit into his thumb. Blood smeared across the wire. He wiped it on his coveralls and kept working. 8 minutes. That was all it took. 8 minutes to decide whether a pilot lived or died. Installing it was harder. The space inside the boom was tight. He worked one-handed, holding a flashlight with the other. Shadows jumped as the beam shifted. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction. The clevis pin slipped. Dropped. He heard it bounce somewhere deep inside the boom. McKenna froze. 5 minutes on his knees, feeling blindly through the dark metal cavity, heart pounding. If someone walked in now, if the engineering officer found him, there would be no explaining this. Finally, his fingers closed around the pin. He reconnected the cable, inserted the piano wire tensioner, forced the clevis pin back into place. He pulled on the cable, no slack. The control surface moved immediately, clean, direct. He replaced the inspection panel. When he stepped back, the aircraft looked exactly the same. That terrified him most. No warning label, no visible sign, nothing to suggest a line had been crossed. McKenna finished just after 1 in the morning. He cleaned his tools, wiped the blood from his hands, walked out into the heavy night air. Somewhere far off, engines droned. Japanese night raiders, maybe. He went to his bunk and didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling and waited for dawn. The test flight began like any other. The P-38 lifted cleanly, climbed smoothly, cruised without incident. If it had felt different under light stress, the experiment would have ended right there. Then the pilot pushed harder. Speed increased. Roll inputs sharpened. Turns tightened. This was the part of the envelope where the Lightning usually resisted, where pilots braced themselves for that familiar hesitation. It never came. Before, stick input, then a pause. After, input. Immediate bite. The pilot rolled left, then right, faster than he had ever felt in a Lightning. No lag, no softness, no negotiation. The airplane felt lighter, not physically but mentally, as if it had stopped arguing. When the pilot landed, he didn't talk about numbers or theory. He talked about trust. He said, "It finally goes where I point it." In combat, that was everything. Word didn't spread through reports or briefings. It spread quietly, between pilots, between crew chiefs. 1 aircraft, then 3, then a dozen. Always discreet, always without paperwork, and then the sky decided if it mattered. The Lightning still wasn't a Zero, but it was no longer helpless. As the modified P-38s continued flying missions, the change in the air became impossible to ignore. It didn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrived as a pattern. Pilots felt it before commanders ever saw it reflected in reports. Men who once flew cautiously now committed. They stayed in fights longer. They pressed attacks instead of breaking away early. The Lightning hadn't become lighter or smaller, but it had become responsive. And that changed everything. Before the modification, many P-38 pilots attacked with one eye already searching for an exit. They were constantly calculating how fast they could disengage if the fight went wrong. That calculation slowed decisions. It introduced hesitation. Now, with the controls answering instantly, pilots began flying proactively instead of defensively. They weren't just reacting to Zeros anymore. They were shaping the fight, forcing reversals, denying angles, choosing when to stay and when to leave. The Zero pilots felt the change from the opposite side of the sky. For months, Japanese pilots had relied on timing as much as skill. They knew exactly how long it took a P-38 to roll. They knew when the American fighter would hesitate. It wasn't guesswork, it was muscle memory. And then the patterns broke. Zeros began encountering Lightnings that no longer behaved the way experience said they should. Aircraft that reversed sooner than expected. Aircraft that stayed inside turns they should have lost. Aircraft that no longer bled position during rapid maneuvering. One Japanese pilot later wrote, "The twin-boom fighter reverses quicker than expected." That single sentence captured the shift. Their advantage hadn't vanished, but it had become unreliable. And in air combat, unreliability is fatal. Japanese after-action reports began to change in tone. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. Some pilots assumed elite American flyers had arrived. Others suspected revised tactics. A few believed a new variant of the Lightning had entered service. None of them guessed the truth, because the truth was invisible. There was no new engine sound, no altered silhouette, no additional armament. The P-38 looked exactly the same. The difference only appeared at the edge of performance, where timing decided who lived and who died. You cannot adapt to a change you cannot identify. You cannot train against something you do not understand. Numbers followed the pattern pilots already felt. In July, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific were losing roughly 2 P-38s for every Zero destroyed. By August, the ratio tightened. By early September, it was nearly even. Quietly. 1 aircraft, then 3, then a dozen. By week's end, nearly half the line had been modified, without paperwork, without authorization, without headlines. Loss rates declined. Engagement outcomes improved. The statistics refused to cooperate with official explanations. Whatever was happening, it was real. On the Japanese side, confidence eroded further. For years, Zero pilots had entered turning fights with near certainty. They believed, correctly, that they owned that part of the sky. Now, that certainty dissolved. Some pilots became cautious, second-guessing maneuvers that once felt automatic. Others tried to compensate with aggression, closing distance faster, firing earlier, taking risks that left no margin for error. That approach only accelerated losses. Quiet guidance began circulating. Avoid prolonged turning engagements with P-38s. Disengage earlier if the fight did not immediately favor you. Those instructions would have been unthinkable months earlier. They marked a psychological shift as much as a tactical one. The hunter was learning to hesitate. And in air combat, hesitation is deadly. The Lightning had not suddenly become dominant in every engagement. It still demanded discipline. Pilots who ignored energy management still paid for it. But the balance had changed. The Zero was no longer untouchable. As the war moved into its later stages, the skies over the Pacific began to change. Allied formations grew larger. Japanese interceptions grew smaller. The balance of power that once felt permanent began to shift. New aircraft entered service. Production accelerated. Experience reshaped tactics on both sides. But for the pilots who flew the P-38 Lightning, one truth remained long after the headlines moved on. The aircraft that once felt dangerous to push had become something they could finally trust when everything went wrong. Trust in an aircraft is difficult to quantify. It does not appear in performance charts. It cannot be graphed or easily measured. Yet every combat pilot knows exactly when it exists and when it does not. Before the modification, many Lightning pilots flew with a quiet fear, always aware that their aircraft might hesitate at the worst possible moment. Afterward, that fear loosened its grip. They still respected the machine's limits, but they no longer felt betrayed by it. The airplane responded when called upon, and that changed how pilots thought, planned, and fought. By this stage of the war, Allied air power was accelerating rapidly. Training pipelines improved. Doctrine evolved. New fighters reduced the Zero's advantages even further. But the Lightning's story stood apart. It was not a story of replacement. It was a story of correction. The P-38 had never been designed to win prolonged turning contests. It was built for speed, for range, for concentrated firepower. Yet war forced it into situations where those strengths alone were not enough. When that reality exposed a deadly flaw, the easiest response would have been denial. Blame the pilots, accept the losses, move on. Many machines throughout history carried weaknesses that were never fully addressed. In the Lightning's case, accepting that flaw would have meant continued deaths. What changed the outcome was not rank, not authority, not formal expertise. It was proximity to the problem. The mechanic noticed the issue because he lived among its consequences. He touched the aircraft every day, listened to pilots who had narrowly escaped death, understood the machine not as a diagram, but as a system under real stress. Flown by frightened, exhausted men who needed immediate response, not theoretical perfection. This matters because war often elevates hierarchy over observation. Solutions are expected to come from certain offices and certain titles. When they do not, they are often dismissed. The wire modification challenged that assumption. It proved that even in the most advanced machines of the era, decisive improvements could come from the lowest levels. From someone willing to see what others had accepted as normal and refuse it. Over time, the modification was quietly absorbed into the system. Later variants of the P-38 incorporated improved control characteristics. Manuals evolved. Training adjusted. Pilots arriving later often never experienced the Lightning's early flaws. To them, it was simply a capable aircraft with a reputation for power and reach. The fear that once haunted earlier crews faded into memory. The mechanic returned to routine work. Aircraft still came back damaged. Pilots still faced danger. War did not pause to recognize small victories. But his contribution lived on in every successful mission, flown by a Lightning that responded instantly instead of hesitating. Every time a pilot pulled hard on the controls and the aircraft obeyed, the wire did its quiet work, History tends to celebrate grand moments, famous aces, decisive battles, revolutionary weapons. Those stories matter, but they often hide a quieter truth. Wars are also shaped by maintainers, technicians, and observers who notice small problems before they become fatal. Their work rarely earns recognition, yet without it, machines fail, and people die. The Lightning story illustrates this perfectly. It was not defeated by the Zero because it was poorly designed. It was challenged because it operated at the edge of what aerodynamics and mechanical control systems could reliably handle. The solution did not require reinventing the aircraft. It required understanding how air, metal, and human reaction time intersect under stress, and making a small adjustment that restored balance. As aviation technology advanced after the war, that lesson endured. Control systems grew more sophisticated. Designers paid closer attention to pilot workload and response time. Eventually, fly-by-wire systems would allow computers to manage aerodynamic forces directly, ensuring stability and responsiveness beyond what purely mechanical systems could provide. The philosophy behind those advances echoed the same principle that guided the wire decades earlier. An aircraft should work with its pilot, not against him. It is tempting to romanticize this story, to imagine a lone genius standing against an uncaring system. The reality is quieter and more powerful. The mechanic was not chasing glory. He was solving a problem that needed solving. His courage was not dramatic. It was professional. He did not seek recognition, and history largely passed him by. The Zero, too, deserves context. It was a remarkable aircraft for its time, built for a specific doctrine and environment. Its early dominance was earned. But no advantage lasts forever. As opponents adapted and technology evolved, its strengths became less decisive. The Lightning's correction was one example of that adaptation. Subtle, unglamorous, devastatingly effective. For pilots who flew against the Zero after the modification, fear changed shape. The enemy remained dangerous, the sky remained unforgiving, but the sense of helplessness vanished. They no longer felt trapped by their own aircraft. That psychological shift mattered as much as any mechanical change. Confidence restores speed. Confidence restores initiative. Confidence wins fights. War is often remembered through numbers and outcomes. Aircraft produced, battles won, territory gained. But for those inside the cockpit, war was lived moment by moment. In those moments, small details decided everything. A fraction of a second in roll response. A control surface that moved instead of resisted. A machine that answered instead of hesitated. The wire represented all of that. It was invisible in photographs. It did not change the aircraft's silhouette. It never appeared in headlines. But it changed how the Lightning behaved when pushed to its limits. It gave pilots back time, and in air combat, time is life. Innovation is not always loud. It does not always come from official channels or formal authority. Sometimes it comes from someone who notices a problem, understands its cost, and refuses to wait for permission while people are dying. The P-38 Lightning did not outmaneuver the Zero because it became something entirely new. It outmaneuvered it because someone helped it become what it was always capable of being. In the unforgiving skies of World War II, a thin wire changed the relationship between man, machine, and air. It saved lives, it shifted confidence. And without ever making noise, it helped decide countless moments where survival mattered most. If you want more forgotten fixes that changed wars, subscribe. The next one is even stranger.